Hi, I'm horror author Paul Edwards. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about my favorite horror movie star in his most evil role. There are a lot of well-known, well-respected actors who made their mark in the horror genre. Lon Chaney Sr., you would have to start with. He was the king of horror in the silent film days. Boris Karloff, who famously portrayed the Frankenstein monster and from there built a career on horror film roles. Bela Lugosi, who played Dracula on stage and then in the 1931 film. And his Hungarian accent somewhat limited the roles that he was able to take. He really saw himself as being like a romantic leading man. But once the film Dracula came out, that was it. He was typecast as a horror character. But he did brilliantly in some horror movies other than Dracula, notably playing Igor in Ghost of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein, and also as Murder LaGrange in White Zombie. But as great as all of those actors were, and I do love them, you just can't top Vincent Price in my book. Vincent Price was the consummate horror film actor. He started out in the 1940s appearing in film noir pictures, but in 1953 he starred in House of Wax, which was a big hit. It was a remake of the 1930s movie Mystery in the Wax Museum. And from then on, Vincent Price was the reigning king of horror. He was in a ton of horror films in the 50s and 60s. Probably most famously in the Edgar Allan Poe adaptations that Roger Corman filmed, like The Pit and the Pendulum and House of Usher. So in 1968, Vincent Price filmed what I consider his most sinister and dark role, which was Witchfinder Matthew Hopkins in the film Witchfinder General. Now, by this time, of course, Price was very well established as a horror icon. But there was an element to camp in all of his previous movies. Not to say that he played the roles for laughs, but the way that he portrayed evil on screen was in a sort of an over-the-top way, where it was creepy and scary, but it was, in a way it was almost fun because he was so over the top. Witchfinder General was a different kind of film for Vincent Price, and he himself only understood this after the fact. Witchfinder General was a very dark, bleak, somber production. It was a fictional story based on the real-life witch hunter Matthew Hopkins, who back in the 1600s had been responsible for the deaths of several hundred people during the witch burnings. And Matthew Hopkins would travel from town to town, helping local authorities to wrongly accuse people of witchcraft, torture them to get confessions that, of course, were highly unreliable, and then executing them, generally by burning them. Matthew Hopkins was a real person. The events depicted in Witchfinder General were the kind of things that Matthew Hopkins did, but they were not exactly, historically accurate. This was a story based on the real-life character of Matthew Hopkins. And in Witchfinder General, I think audiences probably at that time had the expectation going in that they were going to see a witch movie. That, of course, there's a witch hunter, but that there were also real witches using supernatural powers that were going to be opposed by the Witchfinder General. There weren't. Nothing supernatural happened in Witchfinder General. It wasn't that kind of a movie. It was an all too realistic film. What happened in Witchfinder General was that Vincent Price's character, Matthew Hopkins, basically terrorized the countryside, going from village to village, persecuting people that the authorities asked him to, and collecting a fee for each successful persecution. He had an accomplice with him who was also based on a real-life person who was basically a sadistic torturer character. And the dynamic that they present in the film is that Matthew Hopkins might really believe that he is rooting out witches and that his henchman is skeptical of the whole thing and just likes to torture people for money. But there are some elements to the film that make you second guess even that, because Matthew Hopkins, it turns out, in the film can be bribed out of persecuting a particular person. And I plan to keep my channel family friendly, even though this film was not family friendly. So the way I'll describe it is that young women in the village could approach Matthew Hopkins and reach an arrangement by which Matthew Hopkins would not persecute their loved ones. And that does happen in this film. And so Matthew Hopkins doesn't even seem to live up to his own standards, that he's supposedly representing, the forces of Christianity and civilization against evil paganism. But, he himself is obviously committing acts that, no Christian authority would approve of by accepting these kinds of alternate arrangements. So at one point, Matthew Hopkins persecutes the family of a young soldier who's one of Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads. I should point out, by the way, that people sometimes confuse the witch burnings with the Inquisition. Those were two completely different things. The Inquisition, it was actually a series of inquisitions that were done in Catholic countries with the approval of the Catholic authorities. Witch burnings were unheard of in Catholic countries. Witch burnings were unique to Protestant countries. So, each side had something terrible to be responsible for, unfortunately. But the witch burnings were happening in the Protestant territories. And this movie is set all in Cromwell's England during the Civil War against the Royalists. And so Matthew Hopkins persecutes the fiance's family of this Roundhead soldier and kills the priest, who's a member of the family, and abuses and mistreats the young woman who was trying to rescue him and trying to make a bargain to keep him out of trouble. And so now the soldier is on a mission to take down Matthew Hopkins. And he pursues Matthew Hopkins through Cromwell's England and ultimately catches up to him for a final confrontation. Matthew Hopkins is not the kind of villain that Vincent Price was used to playing. The over-the-top, twirling your mustache like the villain in a silent film. It was completely different. Matthew Hopkins, as portrayed by Vincent Price, was just evil. Cold, unsympathetic, relentless, humorless, brutal, and unforgiving. There were no positive attributes to this character. He wasn't the likable kind of bad guy that you would enjoy seeing in a film, which Vincent Price excelled at playing. He was just plain bad, the kind of bad guy that you don't love to hate, you just hate. This was a different approach to villainous roles from what Vincent Price was used to taking. And only after the film had been completed, during the filming, he had butted heads with the director countless times. Only after the film was completed and he saw a screening of it did he realize, okay, now I see what it was that the director was trying to get out of me. A more somber, grim villain. So Witchfinder General was released in 1968. It had a lot of trouble getting past the censors due to the violence and the torture scenes. Quite a bit was edited out. not in a way that would affect story, but they would shorten a lot of the scenes of violence. If you pick up a copy of Witchfinder General now or see one online, you probably will see the restored version in which they have reinserted what was once edited out. It doesn't add anything to the story. It's just more violence, and I don't think it adds anything to the film. But be that as it may, you can see it in its entirety now. So that was Vincent Price's most evil role, Witchfinder General. And if you are a fan of Vincent Price, if you're a fan of 20th century horror films, if you're a fan of witch and monster movies from the 20th century, then you really will like my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. They're available on Amazon.com, 99 cents for an ebook, $9.99 for paperback. Some are available in hardcover, and they are all now available in audiobook. Have a great day.